Here's an introduction into this week's lab on endocrinology and then the frog heart simulation. As usual, we're going to go over the important terms first. The first part here will be on endocrinology. The definition of an endocrine gland is one that secretes its hormones directly into the blood, as opposed to exocrine gland that will secrete its products, its hormones, via a duct. So endocrine glands, they put their hormones directly into the blood. Negative feedback means that a hormone sends, for example, feedback. Once a hormone is there at a certain level, it sends negative feedback back to the pituitary and usually also to the hypothalamus to tell them, it's like, okay, we have enough, so it's time to stop stimulating. A target, that is a cell that has a receptor for a particular hormone. So in general, how it works with the endocrine system is as follows. You're going to have the hypothalamus as the big boss of endocrine function, and then the hypophyseal, that is the old term for the pituitary gland. That's still in this, what they call the hypothalamic, hypophyseal, and then gland axis. So this is the pituitary end right here, and then here would be the actual gland. So the way it works in endocrinology is that the hypothalamus is the big boss. So let's write here the big boss, hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus produces these releasing hormones, the RHs. So when it comes to thyroid hormone specifically, that would be the TRH, the thyroid hormone releasing hormone, the TRH. The TRH will only, any of these releasing hormones, they will only affect the pituitary. And more specifically, the anterior pituitary. So in the case of the specific example with the thyroid hormone, now the pituitary is told by the hypothalamus to make the stimulating hormone, the TSH. And then, by the way, the communication between the hypothalamus and pituitary is sort of private. An RH, the releasing hormone, never enters the general circulation. There's a little private blood supply, a little portal system between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. I should make this a little bit better. Pituitary. So where these RHs, they only affecting the anterior pituitary. So in the case of thyroid, again, so there would be thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, and then the pituitary makes, in response, it makes the thyroid stimulating hormone. Once that is released into the blood, and these hormones from the pituitary do get released into the bloodstream, into the general circulation, then they will affect the target gland, which in this case is the thyroid gland. So in general, let's put the general terms here first. So that will be the gland that's then affected. And in the case of the thyroid hormone, that would be the thyroid gland. Oops, let me fix this. Thyroid gland. The thyroid gland makes two hormones, T3 and T4. Those are the actual hormones that then are affecting the metabolism in general throughout the body. But T3 and T4, they will be released into the blood and then affecting all the cells that have thyroid receptors, which are nuclear receptors, by the way. If you remember that from our study of signal transduction, thyroid hormone is actually works the same way as all of the steroid hormones. It's lipid soluble, and it enters the nucleus, binds to nuclear receptors, and changes transcription in the nucleus. So that takes care of these terms right here. The TRH, we have that up here. That's our TRH, our releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. The TSH, otherwise known as thyrotropin, that's the hormone that comes from the pituitary. That's our stimulating hormone. And that will actually affect the manufacturing of T3 and T4 in the actual gland. Now the thyroglobulin, that's the globulin. It's a binding protein that you need in order to carry the T3 and T4 in the blood, because these again are lipid soluble hormones, and they need to be carried in the blood with a thyroglobulin. Now you might wonder what the 3 and the 4 here stand for. Well, the 3 is triiodothyronine and the T4 will be tetraiodothyronine. So that means, well, 4 or 3 iodines. So it's very important that you have iodine available, because otherwise you will not be able to make these hormones. Tyrosine is the amino acid that is necessary to make the thyroid hormone. So there's basically 2 tyrosine amino acids together, and then you attach the iodines, either 3 or 4, and then you got your triiodo or tetraiodo-thyronine. Now the term here, thyroxine, that's another name for the T4. That's the tetraiodo-thyronine. That is what your thyroid gland, for the most part, releases into the bloodstream, so the thyroxine. Now, once it's at the target cells, then the biologically active form of the hormone is this one right here, the T3. So let's call this biologically active. Bioactive, to make it shorter. This one is the bioactive form. T4 is what's being synthesized by the gland for the most part, and the other word for, or the other term for T4 is thyroxine. Now, you may have heard of something called a goiter. That's basically a hypertrophy of the thyroid glands, and it enlarges, and it's usually due to too much TSH. Now, when would you have too much TSH? So we do have negative feedback loops here from the gland itself back to the pituitary and the hypothalamus. So once we have enough T3 and T4, the message is sent back to the pituitary that, hey, we got enough, we don't need any more. So what if you don't have enough iodine? And the poor gland is trying to make thyroid hormone, but it can't because there's not enough iodine. So hypothalamus and pituitary never received that negative feedback because there was never enough T3 and T4 made, because the gland just couldn't do it. So hypothalamus and pituitary figure, how dare you, gland, not make hormone when I'm telling you to? So they simply just do more of the same. They send out more TRH, which affects the pituitary, and more TSH, which then affects the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland is basically bombarded in this situation with TSH. It's trying to make the hormone, but it can't because there's no iodine or not enough iodine. So it's being bombarded with stimulating hormone and gets larger and larger and larger, and there you have your goiter. The other way you might end up having a goiter would be Graves' disease. So here, going back to the terms non-toxic or endemic, that would be the goiter that you have if you don't have enough iodine. And now a toxic goiter would be Graves' disease, where it's an autoimmune disease and you're making antibodies that act like TSH. They were never sent out by the pituitary, but they act like TSH. So now your body is flooded with antibodies that mimic the effect of TSH. And of course, they do what TSH would normally do. They stimulate the thyroid gland to get bigger and bigger. And the way you would distinguish between the Graves' disease type of goiter versus the lack of iodine type of goiter is, well, if you don't have enough iodine, then you can't make these hormones. So if you find somebody with a goiter that has low T3, T4 levels, then you would say, okay, that's a goiter that's due to lack of iodine. If you have somebody that has very high levels of T3, T4 along with a goiter, then you would assume that you have Graves' disease because there's something else acting like TSH, stimulating the hypertrophy of the thyroid gland, and presumably then you would have Graves' disease. You check for the antibodies that are there, whether they're there or not. So just to recap, so in Graves' disease, you would have high thyroid hormone levels, low TSH levels, and you would find antibodies that mimic the effect of TSH. In the endemic goiter, you find low thyroid hormone levels and high TSH levels because the pituitary is desperate and is trying to convince the gland that it should make the hormone, but it can't because it's not enough iodine. So let's take a look at the remaining terms here. First one here is hyperthyroidism. Hyperthyroidism means that you have too much thyroid hormone, and since thyroid hormone is a stimulator of your metabolism, you would find that you have an ultra high metabolism. You can eat a lot of food, never gain any weight. Sounds actually pretty good. But it also, hyperthyroidism can be pretty dangerous because it has a profound effect on your heart, and it can lead to cardiorhythmias. It can be quite dangerous. So hyperthyroidism, too much thyroid hormone, ultra high metabolism. Also, you might feel hot all the time and just kind of restless. Hypothyroidism is the opposite. So that's would be that you don't have enough thyroid hormone. That's actually easier to treat because you would just give that person some synthetic thyroid hormone. Now, in hypothyroidism, your metabolism is ultra slow. You just look at food, you already gained 5 pounds, and you're tired, you feel cold all the time. So that is a condition you just don't want to be in it, but it's actually easily fixed. Once it's diagnosed, all you would have to do is give that person some extra thyroid hormone. Euthyroidism is what you want, normal thyroid levels. And the next term, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, that's also an autoimmune disease. In Hashimoto's disease, the body produces antibodies that will cause inflammation in the thyroid gland. You might see that this person have a swollen up thyroid gland, which kind of resembles goiter. And also, it usually leads ultimately to hypothyroidism. So it's typically associated with hypothyroidism, not enough thyroid hormone around. PTU is a drug, propylthiouracil. That one absorbs too much thyroid hormone. So if somebody has hyperthyroidism, you could potentially treat them with PTU. Unfortunately, PTU has a nasty side effect because it's a carcinogen. I used to work with that PTU stuff, give it to rats, but nobody cares if a rat has cancer, but you wouldn't want to necessarily give it to treat a person. Thyroidectomy is when you are surgically removing the thyroid gland, and hypophysectomy would be that you're taking out the pituitary. Now, that's not such a good idea, but if it's cancerous, you may have to. But the thyroidectomy, thyroid gland is actually removed fairly frequently in people if they have goiters or other cancerous kind of conditions with the thyroid gland. Okay, so the lab is that you're supposed to figure out different conditions under which the body experiences hyper or hypothyroidism. If you get a chance to do the Physio-X experiment, it's not super intuitive. I'm going to try to post sort of a recording of me doing the experiment, but if I don't get a chance, just kind of follow through with the lab and try to see if you can answer the questions in the back.